Melissa Hayes grew up in Pine Grove, a small Rust Belt town in Pennsylvania, where dreams went to die and ambition was a luxury few could afford. But Sarah Hayes, Melissa's mother, refused to let her daughter's potential fade away like so many others in their community. From the moment Melissa was born, Sarah knew her daughter was destined for something greater than the struggle they faced in their modest trailer home. "You have a gift, Mel," Sarah would whisper while brushing her daughter's golden hair before school. "Your beauty is your ticket out of this place." By age 14, Melissa's striking features, azure eyes that changed color with her mood, high cheekbones, and a camera-ready smile, had already attracted attention. Sarah, working double shifts at the diner to make ends meet, scraped together enough money to send Melissa to modeling auditions in Philadelphia. The investment paid off. At 15, Melissa appeared in local commercials. By 16, she graced regional magazine covers, and at 17, she was walking runways in New York, attending exclusive events where wealth and power congregated. T.I. was at the Metropolitan Gala, a star-studded charity event in Manhattan, that Melissa first caught the eye of Jackson Whitmore, not just any wealthy businessman, but the heir to Whitmore Industries, one of America's largest energy conglomerates. With political connections reaching all the way to the White House and a family fortune estimated in the billions, the Whitmores were American royalty. Jackson stood across the room, his tailored Tom Ford suit accentuating his athletic build. At 35, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no. His gaze was magnetic, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and when he smiled, the entire room seemed to recalibrate around him. "He's looking at you," whispered Tara, another model, nudging Melissa's arm. Jackson Whitmore, his family practically owns half of Texas. Melissa pretended not to notice, but her heart raced. When Jackson finally approached, he didn't use pickup lines or false pretenses. "I've been watching you all evening," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "Would you do me the honor of dinner tomorrow night?" Within weeks, Melissa's life transformed. Private jets whisked her away to Jackson's estate in the Hamptons, his penthouse in Manhattan, his ranch in Wyoming. Extravagant gifts arrived daily. Diamond earrings, designer clothes, even a custom-made Aston Martin on her 18th birthday. Sarah was ecstatic. "This is what I always wanted for you," she told Melissa over the phone from their trailer, which now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. "He's your future, sweetie, don't let him slip away." But Melissa had reservations. Jackson's attentiveness sometimes felt suffocating, his generosity calculated. When she mentioned wanting to continue her modeling career, he smiled indulgently. "Why work for others when you could be a queen in my world?" he asked, caressing her cheek. His touch, though gentle, sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. 6 months into their relationship, during a sunset dinner on his yacht off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, Jackson presented her with an emerald-cut diamond ring that could have paid off her mother's mortgage several times over. "Be my wife, Melissa," he said, his eyes reflecting not a question, but an expectation. The wedding was a spectacle covered by every major news outlet. The guest list read like a who's who of American power: senators, tech billionaires, Hollywood royalty. Melissa walked down the aisle in a custom Vera Wang dress, feeling like the princess her mother had always told her she could be. The public narrative was perfect, the small-town beauty who captured the heart of one of America's most eligible bachelors. Their honeymoon in Bora Bora played out like a fairy tale on social media. Swimming in crystal blue waters, dining under the stars, making love in their overwater bungalow as the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly around them. But paradise didn't last. 2 months into their marriage, living in Jackson's sprawling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, Melissa noticed subtle changes. Her phone would mysteriously reset, erasing messages. Her social media accounts were now managed by Jackson's public relations team. Her childhood friends' calls went unanswered, then eventually stopped altogether. "It's for your security," Jackson explained over dinner, his voice calm but his eyes unreadable. "There are people who would exploit your connection to the Whitmore name." When she mentioned visiting her mother, who still lived in Pine Grove, Jackson's smile remained fixed, but his knuckles whitened around his wine glass. "I've arranged for your mother to move to a lovely condo in Arizona," he said. "The dry air will be better for her arthritis. We can visit when my schedule allows." That night, as Jackson slept beside her, Melissa stared at the ornate ceiling of their bedroom, feeling a growing sense of unease. The mansion, with its 20 rooms and museum-quality art, suddenly felt less like a home and more like a beautiful prison. The next morning, she discovered her passport was no longer in her dresser drawer. "Oh, I had it moved to the safe," Jackson said dismissively when she asked. "Too many staff around, can't be too careful." Her days became structured around Jackson's preferences. He selected her clothes each morning, always elegant, always modest. Her meals were prepared according to a nutritionist he had hired, who emphasized foods optimal for fertility. When she wanted to redecorate a room in the mansion, Jackson gently but firmly overruled her choices. "Darling, interior design isn't your strength," he said with a patronizing smile. "Let's leave that to the professionals." The first time she openly defied him, wearing a dress he had deemed inappropriate to a charity gala. The consequences were subtle but unmistakable. No angry outbursts, no raised voice. Instead, Jackson simply led her away from the event early, his fingers digging painfully into her arm while he maintained a perfect smile for onlookers. Once in their limousine, his expression changed to one of disappointment. "How you embarrassed me tonight," he said quietly, his controlled tone more frightening than any yelling could have been. "I won't tolerate that again." The next day, her personal stylist was replaced, and her closest friend from her modeling days, who had been hired as her assistant, was dismissed for security concerns. Melissa began to understand the terrifying truth of her situation. She wasn't Jackson's wife. She was his possession, a beautiful accessory carefully controlled and displayed. And as the walls closed in around her, she realized that if she didn't find a way out, her golden cage would become her permanent home. 6 months into her marriage, Melissa woke up one morning feeling dizzy. The sensation had become increasingly common, a foggy disorientation that typically followed her evening tea, a special blend Jackson insisted she drink for hormonal balance. Initially, she'd attributed it to stress or perhaps the pressure of trying to conceive, which had become Jackson's singular focus. "I've scheduled another appointment with Dr. Reynolds," Jackson announced over breakfast, scrolling through his phone without looking up. "We need to be more aggressive with the fertility treatments." Melissa pushed her untouched grapefruit around the plate. "I've been feeling strange lately. Maybe we should wait." "Nonsense," Jackson cut her off, finally, meeting her eyes with a smile that didn't reach his own. "Dr. Reynolds says these symptoms are perfectly normal. The injections are helping prepare your body." The injections had started 3 months ago. Weekly appointments in the mansion's private medical suite, where Dr. Reynolds, Jackson's longtime family physician, administered what he called vitamin cocktails to boost her fertility. After each session, Melissa would sleep for hours, sometimes waking with no memory of the afternoon. That morning, as Jackson's driver took him to the office, Melissa slipped into his study, a room she rarely entered without invitation. Her trembling hands searched through his desk drawers until she found what she was looking for. A small leather journal where Jackson meticulously documented everything, from business deals to personal matters. Flipping through the pages, her blood ran cold. There it was in Jackson's precise handwriting: dosages, schedules, effects. The fertility treatments were actually a carefully calibrated combination of sedatives and hormones. The final entry from the previous day read, "M increasingly resistant. Dr. R suggests higher dose of compliance protocol before the Washington C." Drip, compliance protocol. The words burned into her mind. Melissa carefully returned the journal and retreated to her room, her heart pounding. For the first time, she fully comprehended the extent of her captivity. This wasn't just controlling behavior, it was something far more sinister. Jackson wasn't just trying to mold her. He was chemically ensuring her submission. That evening, when their housekeeper Elena brought her usual tea, Melissa waited until she left before pouring it into a potted plant. At dinner, she pretended to take her vitamin pill, but hid it under her tongue, later flushing it down the toilet. For the first time in months, her head remained clear through the night. The next morning, she began planning her escape. She started small, testing boundaries. During a luncheon with Jackson's business associates, she engaged in political discussion, offering opinions that subtly contradicted her husband's known positions. Jackson's smile remained fixed, but his eyes flashed a warning. "My wife has such a vivid imagination," he said smoothly, placing his hand over hers in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like a restraint. "She's been reading too many of those progressive blogs." Later, in their bedroom, he approached her with calculated calmness. "You made me look foolish today," he said, loosening his tie. "That won't happen again, Will." The threat hung in the air between them. Melissa lowered her eyes in apparent submission, but inside her resolve strengthened. She began keeping a secret diary, documenting everything: the medications, the controlling behavior, the isolation. She hid the small notebook inside the lining of an old purse Jackson considered too shabby for her to use anymore. At night, while he slept, she would write by the dim light of her phone's screen. Melissa also started building allies cautiously. Elena, the Mexican housekeeper, who had worked for the family for years, had kind eyes that sometimes lingered on Melissa's when Jackson wasn't looking, a silent acknowledgement of something unspoken. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elena whispered one day while changing the linens, glancing nervously at the door. "My cousin works at the pharmacy. The medications Mr. Whitmore orders for you, they're not for what he says." Melissa felt a rush of validation and terror. "Can you help me, Elena?" The housekeeper hesitated, fear evident in her expression. The last Mrs. Whitmore's assistant tried to help her. She was deported the next day, her entire family investigated by immigration. The revelation hit Melissa like a physical blow. "The last Mrs. Whitmore Jackson was married before?" Elena nodded almost imperceptibly. "For 2 years. She had an accident, swimming pool, very tragic." The information was both terrifying and empowering. Melissa wasn't the first, which meant Jackson had a pattern, evidence if she could uncover it. Her opportunity came during preparations for a major political fundraiser at their estate. Jackson was distracted with arrangements, security, and impressing the governor. Using this rare window of decreased surveillance, Melissa accessed Jackson's private computer while he was in meetings. His password took 3 attempts. Their wedding date, too obvious. His birth date, too simple. Finally, Melissa WR22, the WR standing for Whitmore Reproduction and 22, marking the year she should give him an heir. The thought made her stomach turn. Inside his email, she found correspondence with Dr. Reynolds, going back years discussing candidate management and compliance issues with his previous wife, Catherine. There were documents about Catherine's treatment plan that mirrored her own, and financial records showing a substantial settlement to Catherine's family following her accident. Melissa's hands shook as she forwarded key emails to a new account she'd secretly created, then carefully erased her digital footprints, as Jackson had inadvertently taught her to do when he'd shown off his online security measures. That night at the fundraiser, surrounded by the political elite of the Eastern Seaboard, Melissa played her role perfectly. She wore the emerald gown Jackson had selected, laughed at appropriate moments, and stayed close to his side. But behind her practiced smile, her mind was working feverishly. Governor Richard Collins, a longtime family friend of the Whitmores, pulled her aside during the evening. "You've brought such light to Jackson's life," he said, champagne glass in hand. "After that unfortunate business with Catherine, we worried about him." Melissa maintained her composure. "Catherine and I are very different people, I imagine," she said carefully. The governor's expression flickered with something, concern, recognition, before his political mask returned. "Yes, well, water under the bridge now." He leaned closer. "Though between us, I never believed the official story. Catherine was an excellent swimmer." As he moved away to greet other guests, Melissa felt a chill. The governor knew something wasn't right, yet the Whitmore influence was powerful enough to silence even him. Later that night, as Jackson slept beside her, Melissa slipped out of bed and went to the bathroom. She removed a loose tile she'd discovered behind the ornate vanity and pulled out her diary and a burner phone she'd asked Elena to purchase, promising it was for calling her mother without Jackson monitoring. She typed a message to the email address she'd created. "If anything happens to me, the truth is in this diary and in the emails I've saved. Jackson Whitmore is drugging and imprisoning me, as he did his first wife, Catherine, who I believe did not die accidentally." She attached photos of her diary pages and set the message to send automatically in 72 hours unless she cancelled it. Tomorrow, Jackson would be taking her to Washington, D.C. for a weekend of political events. It would be her first trip away from the estate in months. With the medication no longer in her system and her wits fully about her, this would be her chance. Perhaps her only chance to escape the gilded cage he had built around her. As dawn broke over the Greenwich estate, Melissa replaced the tile, deleted the draft message from the phone, and slipped back into bed beside her husband. Jackson stirred, his arm possessively draping over her. "Good morning." "Beautiful," he murmured, pulling her closer. "Ready for our big weekend?" Melissa smiled, meeting his gaze without flinching. "More ready than you can imagine." The Jefferson Hotel in Washington, D.C. exuded old-world luxury, its marble columns and crystal chandeliers a testament to power and prestige. As Melissa stepped through its grand entrance, Jackson's hand firmly at the small of her back, she fought to keep her expression neutral despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "The ambassador suite is ready for you, Mr. Whitmore," the manager said, personally escorting them through the lobby. "Security protocols have been implemented as requested." Jackson nodded approvingly. "Excellent. My wife and I require absolute privacy this weekend." The words sent a chill through Melissa. She knew what absolute privacy meant. Staff instructed not to respond to her requests without Jackson's approval, limited access to hotel facilities without escort, and monitored communications. The same controlled environment as their Connecticut estate, just with different wallpaper. The suite was spectacular, occupying the entire top floor with panoramic views of the National Mall. Under different circumstances, Melissa might have been awed by the luxury. Now she mentally mapped escape routes, noting the service elevator access point and stairwell location visible from their private terrace. "We have the Energy Secretary's reception at 7, Jackson said, checking his watch. "The car will be here at 6:30. Wear the blue Valentino, it photographs well with the Washington Monument in the background." As Jackson disappeared into the bathroom, Melissa quickly surveyed the suite. Security keypads on the main door, predictable. What was less expected was the small black device blinking on the bedside table, a signal jammer. Her heart sank. Cell phones would be useless unless she could disable it. "The usual staff has unpacked for you," Jackson called from the shower. "Your medication is on the vanity." Melissa approached the marble countertop, where a familiar pill waited beside a glass of water. Dr. Reynolds' special vitamin supplement. For months, she had obediently swallowed it, becoming increasingly compliant. And foggy-headed, now she knew better. "Thank you, darling," she called back, flushing the pill down the toilet and running the water to mask the sound. While Jackson dressed, Melissa pretended to nap, her mind racing through scenarios. The weekend schedule included multiple high-profile events with politicians, energy executives, and foreign dignitaries. People with power, people who might help, if she could reach them without Jackson's surveillance. Her first opportunity came that evening at the reception. The blue Valentino dress hugged her figure, its modest neckline and elegant silhouette meeting Jackson's standards of appropriate display for his wife. As they circulated through the crowd, Jackson maintained physical contact, a hand at her waist, an arm linked through hers, a possessive gesture disguised as affection. Senator Elizabeth Carter, a formidable woman known for her championing of women's rights, approached them. "Jackson, always a pleasure," she said, her smile professional, but cool. Her eyes shifted to Melissa with subtle assessment. "And Mrs. Whitmore, we finally meet. I've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," Melissa replied, with practiced charm. "Naturally," the senator responded, her gaze lingering. "Though, I must say you're nothing like Jackson's first wife. Catherine was quite outspoken." Jackson's grip on Melissa's waist tightened imperceptibly. "My wife needs a refreshment, Senator, if you'll excuse us." As Jackson steered her toward the bar, Melissa caught Senator Carter's calculating look. The senator had deliberately mentioned Catherine, perhaps testing Jackson's reaction. There was intelligence in those eyes, and possibly an ally. Later, that evening, as Jackson was deep in conversation with the energy secretary, Melissa seized her moment. "I need to use the ladies' room," she whispered to Jackson. He frowned slightly. "Take Rebecca with you," he said, nodding toward a sleek woman in a black dress, one of his security team, disguised as a personal assistant. In the opulent bathroom, Rebecca stood guard by the door while Melissa entered a stall. Working quickly, she removed a small note she'd prepared earlier and hidden in her clutch. When she exited, she deliberately dropped her lipstick near Senator Carter's aide, who was washing her hands at the sink. As both women bent to retrieve it, Melissa pressed the note into the aide's palm. "Please," she whispered, so softly it was barely audible. The woman's eyes widened slightly, but she smoothly pocketed the note and exited without acknowledging their exchange. Rebecca, distracted by a text message, hadn't noticed. Back at the reception, Melissa maintained her perfect smile, laughing at appropriate moments, touching Jackson's arm with apparent adoration. But her eyes repeatedly found Senator Carter across the room, watching for any sign that her message had been delivered. Near the end of the evening, the senator approached again, this time with her husband. As the men exchanged pleasantries about golf courses and campaign contributions, Senator Carter leaned closer to Melissa. "My office is hosting a women's leadership breakfast tomorrow at the hotel," she said casually. "Strictly for the ladies. Perhaps you'd like to join us." Before Melissa could respond, Jackson interjected, "Unfortunately, my wife has a prior commitment tomorrow morning. A private spa treatment I've arranged. She's been so tense lately." Senator Carter's expression revealed nothing. "Another time, perhaps," she said, handing Melissa a business card. "If you ever need anything, my door is always open." As they returned to their suite that night, Melissa braced herself for Jackson's reaction. His silence in the elevator was ominous, his jaw tight with controlled anger. Once inside, he loosened his tie with deliberate slowness. "What did you give that woman in the bathroom?" Melissa's blood froze, but years of modeling had taught her how to control her expressions. "What woman?" "Don't play innocent," Jackson said, his voice deadly calm. "Rebecca saw you drop something. What was it?" "My lipstick." "I dropped my lipstick," Melissa replied, maintaining eye contact. "You can ask Rebecca. She watched me pick it up." Jackson studied her face, searching for deception. After a moment, he seemed to accept her explanation, though suspicion lingered in his eyes. "And Senator Carter, what did she say to you?" "Just pleasantries. She invited me to some breakfast tomorrow." "Which you'll be declining," Jackson said flatly. "I don't want you around that woman. She has radical ideas about marriage." Melissa nodded obediently, while inside, hope flickered. The note had been simple. "Help me. Jackson Whitmore is drugging and controlling me. Not safe to talk openly." Whether Senator Carter would act on it remained to be seen, but it was a start. That night, after Jackson fell asleep, Melissa carefully slipped out of bed and padded silently to the suite's study. The signal jammers, blinking light, mocked her from the bedside table, but she had another plan. The hotel offered secure Wi-Fi for its diplomatic guests, a system separate from the normal guest network and likely unaffected by Jackson's jammer. In the study, she located the hotel's business center information and found what she needed, the Tabi diplomatic Wi-Fi password, included as a courtesy for their suite level. Using Jackson's laptop, less likely to be monitored than devices he'd given her, she connected to the network and quickly accessed her secret email account. The message she'd prepared with the evidence against Jackson was still there, scheduled to send automatically unless cancelled. She updated it with new information: their location, Jackson's security measures, Senator Carter's involvement. Then she composed a new email directly to the senator's office address, attaching the key documents she'd discovered about Catherine's accident. As her finger hovered over the send button, she heard a sound from the bedroom, Jackson stirring. Quickly, she set the email to send with a 1-hour delay, cleared the browser history, and shut down the laptop. Back in bed, she regulated her breathing to feign sleep as Jackson's arm wrapped possessively around her waist. Tomorrow would bring the energy industry gala, the weekend's main event. Security would be tight, with cabinet members and foreign dignitaries in attendance. It would also be her best chance to make a public break if Senator Carter hadn't responded by then. What Melissa didn't know was that in a hotel room 3 floors below, Senator Carter was already on the phone with a former prosecutor friend at the Justice Department, discussing the disturbing note she'd received from Melissa Whitmore and the rumors that had long surrounded Catherine's suspicious demise. "I need a discreet security detail," the senator was saying, "and access to any files on Catherine Whitmore's accident investigation. There's a young woman in serious trouble, and we may not have much time." As dawn broke over the Capitol, 2 paths were being set in motion: Jackson's carefully orchestrated weekend of political networking and Melissa's desperate bid for freedom. By the end of the day, only one would succeed. The morning of the energy industry gala dawned with a blanket of gray clouds hanging over Washington. Melissa stood by the suite's floor-to-ceiling windows, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. The weather matched her mood: turbulent, dark, but with the promise of clearing. "Your schedule today?" Jackson announced, sliding a printed itinerary across the breakfast table. "We have the spa appointment at 10. I thought that was just an excuse to decline." "Senator Carter's invitation," Melissa interrupted, a boldness in her voice that made Jackson look up sharply. His smile was thin. "No, it's quite real. Dr. Reynolds suggested some relaxation techniques that might help with our project." The way he said project, their clinical term for getting her pregnant, made her skin crawl. "The technician has been fully briefed on your health requirements. Translation: another person paid to administer whatever drugs Jackson prescribed." "I'd rather skip it," Melissa said, sipping her coffee. "The migraine medication you gave me last night has me feeling a bit nauseous." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "I didn't give you migraine medication last night." Melissa mentally cursed her slip. "The night before, I meant. I'm still feeling its effects." The lie hung between them. Jackson studied her face with newfound suspicion, then checked his watch. "We'll discuss this later. I have a breakfast meeting with the energy secretary. Rebecca will accompany you to the spa at 10. After he left, Melissa moved quickly. She had perhaps 2 hours before Jackson would confirm she hadn't been taking her medication. She needed to act now. The hotel phone seemed safer than any mobile device. She dialed the front desk. "This is Mrs. Whitmore in the Ambassador Suite. I need a schedule of today's events at the hotel." The concierge was eager to help. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. There's the Garden Club luncheon at noon, the Senate Wives' Tea at 2, and Senator Carter's Women in Leadership breakfast, just finishing up in the Constitution Ballroom." Melissa's heart leaped. "Thank you. Could you possibly check if Senator Carter is still in the building?" "One moment, ma'am." After a brief hold, the concierge returned. "The senator has a meeting in the Jefferson Room until 11, Mrs. Whitmore." Melissa hung up and frantically considered her options. Rebecca would be arriving soon to escort her to the spa appointment. The security detail would be watching the elevators and main exits. But there might be another way. She quickly changed into her most understated outfit: black slacks and a simple blouse, clothes Jackson typically dismissed as too plain for public appearances. She pulled her distinctive blonde hair back and tucked it under a scarf, added large sunglasses, and removed her wedding ring, the first time she'd done so since Jackson had placed it on her finger. The terrace of their suite connected to a service area where hotel staff prepared for rooftop events. If she timed it right. At 9:45, she heard a knock at the suite door, Rebecca arriving early, no doubt on Jackson's instructions. Instead of answering, Melissa slipped onto the terrace, and waited until she heard Rebecca use her keycard to enter the suite. As the security woman called her name, Melissa eased the terrace door closed and moved quickly across to the service entrance. A young hotel employee jumped when she appeared. "Ma'am, this area is restricted." Melissa pressed a finger to her lips. "I need your help," she whispered urgently. "I'm trying to surprise Senator Carter with a donation for her women's charity. Can you show me the service elevator?" The young man hesitated, then nodded toward a nondescript door. "Down that way, ma'am. It'll take you to the service corridor on 3 near the Jefferson Room." Melissa thanked him with a grateful smile and hurried to the elevator, heart pounding. As the doors closed, she heard Rebecca's voice calling for her on the terrace. The service elevator deposited her in a bustling back corridor where staff pushed carts of linens and room service trays. Melissa moved confidently, as if she belonged there, following signs toward the Jefferson Room. She nearly collided with the security guard as she rounded a corner. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, eyeing her suspiciously. "This area is restricted during the senator's meeting." Melissa removed her sunglasses, letting tears fill her eyes. "Please," she whispered, "I need to speak with Senator Carter. It's a matter of life and death." The guard's expression softened slightly. "Your name, ma'am?" "Melissa Whitmore. Please tell her it's about the note from last night." Recognition flickered in the guard's eyes. After a moment's hesitation, he spoke into his radio, then gestured for her to wait. Less than a minute later, the door opened and Senator Carter herself appeared, surprise evident on her face. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said carefully, "please come in." The Jefferson Room contained a small gathering: the senator's chief of staff, 2 aides, and a serious-looking woman in a dark suit whom Melissa didn't recognize. "This is Special Agent Diana Morris, FBI," Senator Carter said, closing the door firmly behind them. "We were just discussing your situation." Relief washed over Melissa so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. "You got my email? My note?" "Both," the senator confirmed. "And we've been looking into some irregularities surrounding Catherine Whitmore's accident. But we need to move quickly. Your husband has considerable influence, and I'm already receiving calls about a missing spouse from the hotel management." Agent Morris stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, we need your formal statement. If what you're alleging is true, drugging, unlawful imprisonment, possible involvement in the death of his first wife, we can take you into protective custody immediately." Melissa nodded, composure finally breaking. "I have evidence. The diary, the emails I forwarded, and blood tests. If you test me now, you'll find traces of the drugs he's been giving me, though I've been avoiding them for the past few days." As she spoke, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Raised voices, then the unmistakable authoritative tone of Jackson Whitmore. "My wife is having a psychiatric episode," they heard him telling someone. "Her doctors have been treating her for delusional paranoia. I have the paperwork right here." Senator Carter exchanged glances with Agent Morris. "Back door," the senator said quietly, gesturing to a side exit. "My car is waiting at the east entrance." But before they could move, the main door burst open. Jackson stood there, flanked by 2 men in dark suits, private security, and a distinguished older man Melissa recognized as Dr. Reynolds. Behind them stood the hotel manager, looking deeply uncomfortable. "There she is," Jackson said, his voice a masterpiece of concerned husband. "Melissa, darling, you forgot your medication this morning. Everyone's been so worried." Dr. Reynolds stepped forward, medical bag in hand. "Mrs. Whitmore needs immediate attention. This episode is exactly what we've been treating." Agent Morris moved protectively in front of Melissa. "Mr. Whitmore, your wife is currently giving a statement to federal authorities regarding serious allegations against you." Jackson's expression didn't falter. "Agent Morris, FBI." "Agent Morris, my wife suffers from a rare psychiatric condition that causes paranoid delusions. We have extensive medical documentation." He nodded to Dr. Reynolds, who produced a file. "These episodes are triggered when she stops taking her prescribed medication, which she apparently has done. Senator Carter's chief of staff, a former prosecutor, spoke up. "Those documents would be easy to falsify for someone with your resources, Mr. Whitmore." Jackson's eyes hardened momentarily before his concerned expression returned. "Senator Carter, with all due respect, this is a private medical matter. My only concern is my wife's well-being." The room had become a standoff. Jackson and his team at the door, Senator Carter's group protectively surrounding Melissa. The hotel manager looked increasingly distressed, clearly dreading the publicity nightmare unfolding in his establishment. "Perhaps," Dr. Reynolds suggested smoothly, "we could resolve this with a simple blood test. If Mrs. Whitmore isn't taking her prescribed medication, that would explain these delusions. We can have results within hours." It was a calculated move. If Melissa's system still contained traces of the drugs Jackson had been giving her, it would support his story that she needed medication. If not, it would appear she had indeed stopped taking necessary psychiatric medication. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Melissa made a decision. She stepped forward, past Agent Morris's protective stance, and looked directly into Jackson's eyes. "Test my blood," she said clearly, "and test his too." She turned to Agent Morris, "And I want the samples split, half to his doctor, half to an independent lab of your choosing." She faced Jackson again. "If you have nothing to hide, you'll agree to that." Jackson's perfect composure slipped for just a millisecond, a flash of rage quickly masked. In that instant, everyone in the room saw it. "Of course," he said, voice tight, "anything to help my wife." As Dr. Reynolds prepared to draw blood samples under the watchful eye of Agent Morris, Melissa felt a strange calm settle over her. For the first time in months, she was fighting back. Win or lose, she had broken the silence. His perfect facade was cracking before witnesses who couldn't be easily dismissed or controlled. "We'll need a few hours for the independent lab results," Agent Morris stated, sealing the second set of samples. "In the meantime, Mrs. Whitmore will remain under federal protection." "Absolutely not," Jackson countered, his voice razor-sharp despite his still pleasant expression. "My wife comes home with me, where her medical needs can be properly addressed." "Senator," Carter stepped forward, "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Whitmore. Given the nature of these allegations and Mrs. Whitmore's explicit statement that she fears for her safety, federal protective custody is appropriate until this matter is resolved." The hotel manager cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we could move this discussion somewhere more private. The Energy Gala preparations are beginning downstairs." Jackson's eyes flashed dangerously. "This isn't over," he said quietly, focusing on Melissa. Then louder to the room, "I love my wife. I've only ever wanted what's best for her health and happiness. When she's properly medicated again, she'll understand that." As Jackson and his team reluctantly exited, Melissa released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Agent Morris immediately pulled her aside. "We need to move quickly," she said. "A man with his connections can cause significant interference. We'll take you to a secure location while our team expedites the blood analysis and investigates your claims regarding Catherine." "He won't give up easily," Melissa warned. "He believes I belong to him." "No one owns you, Mrs. Whitmore," Senator Carter said firmly. "And we're going to make damn sure Jackson Whitmore learns that lesson." Within 20 minutes, Melissa was being escorted through the hotel's loading dock into an unmarked government vehicle. As they pulled away, she caught a glimpse of Jackson in the hotel lobby, phone pressed to his ear, watching her departure with cold, calculating eyes. The battle had only just begun. The safe house in Arlington was nothing like the luxury Melissa had become accustomed to, a modest 3-bedroom colonial with faded curtains and furniture that had seen better days. Yet as Agent Morris showed her to a small but clean bedroom, Melissa felt something she hadn't experienced in nearly a year. Peace. "It's not the Ritz," Morris apologized, placing Melissa's hastily packed overnight bag on the bed. The FBI had retrieved it from the hotel after obtaining a warrant. "It's perfect," Melissa replied sincerely. "No one's monitoring me here." While Agent Morris set up security protocols, Melissa sat at the kitchen table with a legal team, recounting every detail of her marriage to Jackson. The words poured out of her, The gradual isolation, the controlling behaviors, the drugging, and most disturbingly, what she'd learned about Catherine's suspicious end. "We've reopened the investigation into Catherine Whitmore's accident," confirmed Assistant U. Hess attorney Samantha Reeves, a sharp-eyed woman with salt and pepper hair. The medical examiner who handled the case has some interesting new perspectives now that he's retired and, as he puts it, beyond the reach of Whitmore influence. The blood test results arrived that evening. Melissa's sample showed traces of 3 controlled substances: a powerful sedative, a mild hallucinogen known to increase suggestibility, and a hormone regulator typically used to treat endocrine disorders. None of these match any legitimate psychiatric medication regime, Dr. Eliza Chen, the independent specialist, explained. These drugs in combination would make someone physically compliant, mentally foggy, and emotionally dependent. "And Jackson's blood test?" Melissa asked. "Clean as a whistle," Agent Morris replied. "Not even aspirin." The evidence was mounting, but Jackson wasn't going down without a fight. By morning, the media storm had begun. Melissa watched in disbelief as news channels reported on her psychiatric breakdown and Jackson's heroic efforts to help his troubled wife. Anonymous sources claimed she had a history of mental health issues that she'd hidden before their marriage. "Don't worry," Senator Carter assured her during a brief visit. "We anticipated this. The Whitmores have always controlled the narrative through their media connections." The senator handed Melissa a tablet displaying several news sites. "But the tide is turning. These outlets are asking different questions. About Catherine's death, about Jackson's history of controlling behavior with other women before you." Former staff had come forward, including a nurse who had worked with Dr. Reynolds and claimed she'd been fired after questioning the treatment of Mrs. Whitmore, not Melissa, but Catherine before her. 3 days into Melissa's protective custody, the legal strategy was clear. They had enough for criminal charges of drugging and unlawful imprisonment against Jackson, and a separate investigation into Catherine's death was progressing rapidly. But Jackson's legal team was formidable, and his public relations machine was in overdrive, portraying him as the caring husband of a mentally unstable woman. "We need to change the narrative," Melissa said during a strategy meeting. "I want to speak publicly." The room erupted in objections. It was too dangerous. Jackson's team would twist her words. The case could be compromised. Melissa stood firm. "I've spent a year being silenced, portrayed as whatever suited Jackson's needs. I won't hide in the shadows anymore." She looked around the table. "Let me tell my story, not just for me but for Catherine, for any woman who's been controlled and silenced." After much debate, a plan was formed. Melissa would give a single interview, not to a major network where Whitmore influence ran deep, but to an independent journalist known for her integrity and fearlessness in confronting powerful men. Rebecca Chen had built her reputation exposing corporate corruption and abuse of power. Her online news platform wasn't the biggest, but it was trusted, and stories that began there often forced mainstream media to follow. The interview took place in the safe house living room, Melissa sitting straight-backed in a simple blue dress. Her choice, not designer, not picked by anyone else. "Mrs. Whitmore, or do you prefer Ms. Hayes?" Rebecca began. "Melissa, please," she answered, reclaiming her identity with those simple words. For the next hour, Melissa shared her story, not with tears or dramatics, but with clear-eyed determination. She described the gradual erosion of her freedom, the drugging, the psychological manipulation, and what she'd discovered about Catherine. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she concluded. "I'm asking for justice, for myself, for Catherine, and for any woman trapped in a gilded cage." When Rebecca asked why she had finally decided to escape, Melissa's answer was simple. "Because I realized the price of all that luxury was my soul, and no mansion, no jewelry, no prestigious name is worth that." The interview went live the next morning. By noon, it had been viewed 8 million times. By evening, mainstream outlets were reporting on shocking allegations against Energy Heir Jackson Whitmore. Former acquaintances of Catherine came forward with stories that eerily paralleled Melissa's experience. 2 other women revealed brief relationships with Jackson, that had become frightening when they tried to break things off. The Whitmore machine responded predictably, attacking Melissa's credibility, suggesting she was after money, claiming she had fabricated evidence to escape a prenuptial agreement. But for once, Jackson's well-crafted image couldn't withstand the onslaught of truth. The turning point came when Elena, the housekeeper, gave a tearful interview describing how she had witnessed Jackson's controlling behavior and Dr. Reynolds administering injections that left Melissa unconscious. Elena had risked her job and possibly her immigration status to speak out. 7 days after Melissa's escape, a grand jury indicted Jackson Whitmore on charges of administering controlled substances without consent, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. Dr. Reynolds faced similar charges, along with medical ethics violations. The investigation into Catherine's death was upgraded to a potential homicide inquiry. But freedom came with a price. Sarah Hayes, Melissa's mother, faced brutal public scrutiny. The media painted her as an opportunistic parent who had sold her daughter to a wealthy man. Old neighbors in Pine Grove gave interviews describing Sarah's ambitions for her daughter, her fixation on Melissa's beauty as a meal ticket. The truth, as always, was more complicated. A tearful phone reunion between mother and daughter revealed Sarah's genuine remorse. "I wanted a better life for you," Sarah sobbed. "I never thought he would hurt you." Melissa found forgiveness came easier than expected. "You did what you thought was best with the options you had," she told her mother. "Now we both know there are some prices too high to pay." The legal battles stretched on. Jackson's arrest had sent shockwaves through financial markets, with Whitmore Industries' stock plummeting. His family deployed every resource to discredit Melissa and protect their dynasty. She received death threats from anonymous sources, was vilified by conservative commentators as a gold digger, and had her past scrutinized for any hint of impropriety. "Are you sure you want to continue?" Agent Morris asked one evening, after a particularly vicious news segment questioning Melissa's character. "We could arrange a settlement. You could start fresh somewhere. New identity, new beginning." Melissa considered the offer, the temptation of escape from the media circus. Then she shook her head. "Running would only strengthen their narrative that I have something to hide," she said. "I won't disappear for their convenience." 6 months after her escape from the Jefferson Hotel, Melissa stood on the steps of the federal courthouse after Jackson's bail hearing. His legal team had failed to prevent him from being remanded to custody while awaiting trial, a rare instance of the justice system treating a wealthy defendant like any other. Cameras flashed as she approached the microphone. Gone was the carefully styled trophy wife. In her place stood a woman transformed by adversity, still beautiful, but with a strength and purpose that had nothing to do with appearances. "Today is not about vengeance," she began, her voice steady. "It's about accountability. No amount of money, power, or influence should place anyone above the law or give them the right to control another human being." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "To anyone watching who feels trapped in a relationship, where your voice is silenced, your movements controlled, your reality manipulated, know that you are not alone. Help is possible. Freedom is possible." The speech was brief but powerful. As she stepped away from the podium, Senator Carter approached with news. The foundation they had established to help women escape controlling relationships had received donations from thousands of supporters. Catherine's parents had joined the board, determined that their daughter's story would help others. 1 year to the day after her Washington escape, Melissa stood on the beach near a small cottage in Oregon that she now called home. The legal battles had ended with Jackson's conviction, though appeals would likely continue for years. A separate trial regarding Catherine's death was pending, with new forensic evidence challenging the accidental drowning ruling. Melissa had refused the massive settlement Jackson's family had offered in exchange for her silence. Instead, she had accepted a more modest divorce agreement and dedicated herself to advocacy work, speaking at universities and women's shelters about recognizing the red flags of controlling relationships. The media spotlight had finally begun to fade. allowing her space to rebuild her life on her own terms. She had enrolled in college courses, not modeling or fashion, but psychology and law, tools she hoped would help her help others. As waves lapped at her feet, Melissa breathed deeply, savoring the simple pleasure of walking alone on a beach, making her own choices, being answerable to no one. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, who was visiting next week. Their relationship was healing slowly, built now on honesty rather than expectations. A notification popped up. Another woman had reached out through the foundation, describing a relationship with frightening similarities to what Melissa had endured. Another person needing help finding their way to freedom. Melissa turned from the ocean and walked back toward her cottage. It wasn't a mansion. There were no staff, no luxury cars, no private jets. But it was hers, truly hers, and that made it more valuable than all the riches in the world. The golden cage had not defined her. Breaking free had. Film de Historia. If you found Melissa's journey from captivity to freedom moving, there's more where that came from. We've curated a special playlist of equally compelling stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and personal triumph. Find it by clicking the link to your left. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video to help others discover these powerful narratives. Every day, we bring you unique stories that illuminate the human experience in all its facets. Join our community in the comments section below and share your thoughts on Melissa's remarkable path to liberation. We'll be waiting to hear from you.